The summit had the sheen of a corporate shareholder meeting rather than the humility of a gathering of faith leaders. Giant LED screens beamed Kenneth Copeland's image above slogans of prosperity and blessing, while ushers in matching suits guided guests with rehearsed precision. The crowd was thick with anticipation, a restless hum running through the aisles, more performance than worship. Into this spectacle stepped Jonathan Roumie, his Bible pressed quietly in his hand. His demeanor, calm yet aware, his steps were unhurried, his smile soft. But beneath his composure was a flicker of unease he couldn't ignore. Whispers moved like smoke through the hall, too faint for microphones but sharp enough to sting. "He's here for optics," one man muttered. "Just their token humility," another replied, smirking. Jonathan kept walking, each glance and murmur absorbed in silence, his choice not to respond more powerful than any rebuttal. Copeland's entrance was the opposite, an entourage flanking him, the crowd rising in orchestrated applause, cameras flashing. His handshake to Jonathan was clipped, the kind of politeness that dismissed as it pretended to welcome. No warmth lingered, no acknowledgement beyond the gesture. "Glad you could make it," Copeland said, eyes already turning to someone else. Jonathan nodded with the same calm, but he could feel the distance stretch between them like a gulf carved in the open. On stage, the contrast became sharper under the lights. Copeland sat in the center, posture straight, his navy suit catching the glow, radiating authority. Jonathan was placed at the far end, his Bible resting quietly on his lap, the posture of someone who hadn't come for spectacle, but for truth. When the panel began, Copeland's answers spilled with practiced confidence, prosperity woven into every phrase, victory, increase, destiny, blessing. The audience cheered, clapping at the words they'd been taught to expect. When Jonathan spoke, his voice was steady, softer but cutting in its simplicity. "When we feed the hungry, when we visit the sick, when we listen without rushing to fix, we are showing the world who Jesus is." The air shifted almost imperceptibly. Murmurs stirred. Some nodded, some frowned. Others glanced toward Copeland. The tightening of Copeland's jaw betrayed what his words tried to hide. He leaned forward, redirecting. "Of course," he said with a faint chuckle. "We must also equip believers to live in victory and abundance. The Lord wants us to prosper." The crowd applauded again, but the contrast had been drawn too clearly for anyone to miss. Jonathan didn't challenge him openly, but his silence afterward pressed heavier than argument, his stillness amplifying the divide. In the second row, a preacher leaned toward his neighbor, whispering, "He won't last up here." Another chuckled softly, "Copeland won't let him steer this ship." Their words were drowned out by the moderator's attempt to move forward, yet even his voice faltered, strained under the tension. The panel pressed on with forced momentum, but the unease in the room thickened. Jonathan's presence was quiet, but it unsettled, his words of surrender set against Copeland's performance of plenty. Then came the break. Copeland's voice cut suddenly, crisp and public. "Jonathan, I think it's time you step off the stage." Gasps rippled like a wave. Cameras zoomed, audience members leaned forward. Jonathan blinked once, slowly, as though testing the weight of the words. "Excuse me?" he asked softly. "You've made your point," Copeland said, gesturing toward the steps, his tone framed with politeness but laced with dismissal. "Thank you for joining us." The audience froze. Some looked away, uncomfortable at the spectacle of a man being dismissed. Others watched hungrily, waiting for humiliation. Jonathan's hand pressed against the worn leather of his Bible as he rose slowly. His movements were calm, deliberate, each step toward the edge magnified under the burning lights. The room held its breath, caught between silence and storm. Would he walk away quietly, erased in front of thousands, or would something else ignite in those 44 seconds that hung like eternity before the fall? Jonathan's steps toward the edge of the stage carried with them a weight that few in the audience could understand, but many could feel. The silence of the present began to braid itself with the shadows of what had led him there, memories surfacing like scenes cut into the film of the moment. He remembered the ornate envelope with its gold trim and embossed seal, arriving weeks before. It had felt less like an invitation to fellowship and more like a summons to a palace. His friend's warning echoed again. Copeland Summit? You, sure about that? The doubt pressing heavier now as he moved closer to the steps. At the airport, he had overheard two men in suits, one whispering, "He's just there to make them look broad-minded." The other chuckling, "Won't last long up there." He hadn't flinched then, but the words had lodged in his spirit, like pebbles inside a shoe, unavoidable reminders of why he had accepted in the first place. Light, he had thought, belonged where shadows were thickest. The flashbacks blurred into the memory of the luncheon, where the surface glitter of hospitality had peeled away under careless whispers. "He's just their token humility," a staffer had muttered, a colleague smirking in reply. At that table, men boasted about net worth, private jets, new wings of their churches, while Jonathan had stirred his coffee in silence, his words carefully measured. Now, as the audience watched him move across the polished stage, those contrasts became visible even to those who hadn't heard the whispers. Copeland's empire loomed over the moment, the screens, the applause, the practiced posture, and yet it stood in stark opposition to the quiet image now seared into their minds, a man with a Bible pressed to his chest, walking under the weight of dismissal. The room remembered what he had already said, replaying in silence. We can't measure God's favor by what fills our hands, but by what fills our hearts. The line returned like an echo, clashing against the spectacle of Copeland's promises of abundance. Murmurs traveled through the rows, low but piercing, and the tension in the air grew heavier with every breath. "He's not here to defend himself," a young pastor whispered from the third row, voice trembling with conviction. "He's defending the gospel." The words spread in hushed tones, picked up by ears desperate to name what they were seeing. Students seated toward the back began to clap softly, an instinctive gesture of courage, but the sound faltered and fell into silence, swallowed by fear of who sat at the center of the stage. Narration painted the imbalance with clarity. Copeland, high-backed chair gleaming under the lights, power radiating from posture and reputation, versus Jonathan, pushed into the corner of silence, stripped of the microphone, yet somehow larger in the gravity of the moment. Every step toward the exit only magnified that defiance, a refusal to be erased even as the machinery of spectacle tried to script his departure. The audience leaned forward, unable to turn away. This was no longer a panel discussion. It was no longer about polished sound bites or carefully curated appearances. It had become trial by silence, the gospel standing quietly against the performance of prosperity. Jonathan slowed near the steps, his head bowed, his thumb pressing into the worn leather of the Bible he carried, a gesture that looked to many like prayer. The suspense thickened. Was this humiliation? Was this surrender? Or was this the prelude to something unscripted, something that could not be controlled by cameras, moderators, or stage lights? The crowd held its collective breath, the moment straining under the unbearable weight of anticipation. It was clear now. Copeland had staged the dismissal, but what would follow was not his to command. Jonathan stopped just short of the steps, his body still, his head lowered slightly as though listening to something deeper than the noise of the room. The audience leaned forward, sensing that his silence was not emptiness, but intention. The cameras, guided by instinct, zoomed in tighter, capturing the faint press of his thumb against the leather of his Bible. 44 seconds stretched like an eternity, each tick of time swelling the tension until it felt unbearable. The lights overhead glared brighter, sweat beginning to gather on Copeland's temple, though he sat perfectly still, his hands clasped too tightly on the arms of his chair. Murmurs rose and died as quickly as they came, until the silence was absolute. Then Jonathan turned. His shoes whispered against the polished stage as he walked back toward the center, the weight of every eye following him. He did not hurry. He did not dramatize. He simply moved with a calmness that felt like storm clouds rolling into place. When he reached the microphone, he lifted his head, eyes steady, voice soft, but sharper than steel. "What does it profit, a man to gain the whole world yet forfeit his soul? The words from Mark 8:36 did not need volume to strike. They cut through the air with a clarity that pierced even the most resistant hearts. Gasps rippled instantly, and then came the silence, deeper than before, like a hall stunned by lightning. He did not rush to explain. He let the verse breathe, hang over the audience like a question none could answer. In the third row, a woman lowered her head into her hands, her shoulders shaking with sobs. A pastor mouthed the verse under his breath, as if reminding himself it had always been written there, always waiting for this moment. A man in the back shifted uneasily, his gold watch flashing under the lights, suddenly heavy against his wrist. Jonathan's voice came again, softer still, but infused with weight. Our Lord never measured faith by wealth, but by surrender. Copeland gripped the arms of his chair tighter, his knuckles whitening, his practiced smile long gone. His jaw tensed, his gaze dropped briefly toward the floor, the edges of his composure cracking for all to see. Jonathan did not raise his voice, did not accuse. He testified, each word landing like truth etched into stone. The gospel is not a commodity. It cannot be bought. It cannot be packaged. It cannot be sold. The room shifted restlessly. Some nodded, tears glistening in their eyes. Others stared straight ahead, caught between shame and conviction. Copeland's shoulders stiffened, but the sweat on his brow betrayed the effort it took to remain still. The atmosphere changed. Students in the back, their eyes wide, began to clap, hesitant at first, then stronger. The sound spread, picking up rhythm, until more stood, the clapping echoing like thunder rolling through the rafters. A chant rose, Jonathan's name whispered, then spoken aloud. Diplomats, usually trained into silence, wiped tears discreetly, their hands trembling as they pressed cloths to their faces. The hall had become more than a summit. It was now a courtroom of conscience, where arrogance was judged by humility, where silence had become testimony. Cameras immortalized it, the calm man standing unbroken, the empire's figurehead shrinking, visibly under the weight of words no wealth could erase. Jonathan's eyes swept the hall without anger, only resolve. His stillness expanded, magnified by the contrast of Copeland's pale, stiff form, trapped in a chair that had once symbolized dominance, but now looked like a prison. The chant swelled, the applause roared, yet in the center of it all, Jonathan remained steady, his Bible closed but his message wide open. The hall had transformed into a stage of reckoning, and before millions who would watch it later, the image was clear. A man of humility standing tall while an empire's image faltered and cracked. The roar of applause swelled like a storm, then ebbed into a silence so dense it seemed to press against the walls, a silence more powerful than any noise. Jonathan Roumie stood for a moment longer, his Bible resting against his chest, then slowly closed it with deliberate calm. Without flourish or victory in his step, he descended the stage, leaving the verse behind him like smoke that clung to the air. Every camera followed, but he did not look back. Copeland forced a smile, his lips trembling as he muttered a hollow, thank you," into the microphone. But his voice cracked, betraying the fragility beneath. The program lurched forward, desperate to reclaim rhythm, yet the audience remained fractured. Some clapping mechanically out of habit, others still frozen, their hearts pierced by what they had heard. Narration slowed, capturing the unease as the crowd filed out afterward, voices hushed and searching. "That verse," someone whispered. "That was the real sermon." Groups lingered in corners, replaying the moment in fragmented retellings, hands gesturing, voices wavering, as if afraid to dilute what had happened by speaking too plainly. By nightfall, clips flooded the internet. 44 seconds that replayed endlessly on phones, on televisions, on projection screens in living rooms. Captions blazed across timelines. 44 seconds that shook the summit. Headlines sharpened, commentary exploded. Pastors debated in private rooms, some condemning Roumie for rebellion, others confessing quietly that he had spoken what they had long been afraid to admit. Roumie himself said nothing. Days passed, then a week, and the only thing he offered was a single post, Mark 8:36, written plainly without commentary. The verse alone did what no essay could. Silence became his weapon, spreading farther than any defense. His restraint left room for others to speak, to wrestle, to question. Meanwhile, Copeland scrambled to recover, issuing statements laced with polished assurance, yet none rang true. His empire's machinery churned as before. Broadcasts aired, events planned. But something invisible had cracked. The whispers grew sharper. Congregants began to frown when he repeated prosperity mantras. Critics replayed Roumie's verse. Alongside Copeland's appeals, the contrast damning. Weeks later, in his own pulpit, Copeland stumbled when reading scripture. His eyes landed on the same verse, Mark 8:36, and his tongue faltered. A hush swept the room, some leaning forward as though waiting for him to confess, others looking away, unwilling to watch the unraveling. Outside those walls, whispers followed. Him, neighbors avoiding eye contact at the grocery store, colleagues retreating into silence, headlines daring to question the untouchable edifice of his empire. For the first time, his certainty no longer filled the room. It shrank, pale and fragile under scrutiny. Meanwhile, Jonathan moved on quietly, visiting small congregations, speaking in plain voices to people gathered in folding chairs and crowded living rooms. His message never shifted, always circling back to surrender over spectacle, humility over grandeur. In kitchens, families repeated his words over prayer. In country churches, children recited the verse from memory. In whispered, midnight conversations, believers repeated it to steady their faith. He did not need to defend what had happened. The world had already received it, carried it forward like a fire spreading from hand to hand. The story closed not with triumphal victory, but with reflection, the verse echoing as both warning and hope. What does it profit a man to gain the whole world, yet forfeit his soul? In that echo lived a deeper truth, whispered across nations. True education, true faith, true power, it is never in what you gain, but in what you refuse to sell. Silence stung, dignity endured, and the world, unsettled yet awakened, left forever changed.